We had just returned from the City Hall's Christmas celebration, and Grandpa was in rare form. He had taken off the beard, but he was still wearing the red suit and iconic cap of the jolly old St. Nick. He had agreed to be the city's Santa that year, and not even the most jaded of children that had sat on his lap had been less than enchanted with him. I had little doubt that there was more than one parent who was scrabbling to fulfill the holiday's wish list that some child had thrust Grandpa's way. But that was to be expected. This was Christmas time, after all, and it was a time for magic. To my surprise, Glimmer had agreed to come with us. I'd been trying to get her more comfortable with groups of people, wanting to let the people in town see her if we intended to be an item, and after some discussion and a little begging, she had agreed to come with us.
It will be nice to see this town. I have heard so much about you and Fisher.
I had bought her a gaudy Christmas sweater from Walmart, complete with a festive green hat to hide her ears, and she had laughed herself sick at the sight of it. It was the color of tinsel, the outside silver and shiny with some red and gold puffballs to break it up a little, and she claimed it was the ugliest thing she had ever seen. It was warm, though, not that the cold bothered her much, and the townspeople had been happy to see her again. So many of them remembered her from Halloween the year before, and we heard endlessly how cute a couple we made. The sweater, I discovered as we sat by the fire in the living room, was just as scratchy as I had thought it would be, but I didn't mind too much. Glimmer snuggled close, her hands clutching at the cup of hot chocolate that Grandpa had made for us, and I was happy to have both the fire and her warmth as I tried to warm the chill from my bones. The snow hadn't left the area since Halloween, and it was one of the coldest winters I could remember.
This warm drink gets better and better every time I have it. What do you call this white fun on top?
I tried not to laugh. Whipped cream. The little ones floating on top are called marshmallows.
Fascinating.
She said it with something close to reverence. Grandpa came back with a cup of his own and sighed happily as he settled into his favorite chair. It's always such a joy to see the kids' faces this time of year. I hope they all get exactly what they want from St. Nick. I smiled. It was nice to see Grandpa so happy. Grandpa wasn't usually prone to melancholy, but sometimes he did get a little introspective, and it seemed to make him blue. Holidays were always good times for Grandpa, and it was nice to see him enjoying life. As long as you don't go and set up your own workshop and try to fill the void when he doesn't, I joked, drawing a laugh from Grandpa. Oh no, I would never try to compete with the man himself. If Santa can't bring the kiddies of Kashmir what they want, then it just can't be done. We laughed, but Glimmer looked slightly confused.
You speak of this Santa Claus like he's real. He's just a story of children, isn't he?
I started to tell her yes, but Grandpa looked scandalized. Oh, heavens, no. Santa's as real as you or I. I met him once when I was in Alaska. Didn't I tell you that story already? I shook my head, more than ready to hear this little tale. No, but you've hinted at it more than once. I've honestly been waiting to hear this one. Grandpa chuckled. I imagine you have. Very well. Let me tell you about the time that I helped save Christmas. It was December 24th, 1945, and I was as lost as I had ever been. I'd been making a delivery, somewhere. I can't remember, but it was a backwater amongst backwaters. I was in the smaller truck. No need for a huge trailer when you were delivering little more than supplies, and I'd just taken a Christmas feast to a town smaller than the military base I had been at. They had invited me to stay, but I was still hoping to get back in time to see your grandma before it got too late. Well, as the sun set and I was still trying to find the road back to Wellerbrook, I was coming to the conclusion that I wasn't going to get home before midnight. There were no cell phones, of course, so I couldn't call my boss and tell him what was happening. I was still trying to find the road again as my truck sat on a quarter of a tank, and I sat by the road and reviewed a map that I hoped was accurate. So, when someone came by and tapped on my door, I jumped high enough to bang my head on the roof of the cab. There, in the middle of nowhere, stood a little old man in a long red coat and a red bucket hat, what you would call a taxicab driver hat now, I suppose. He had a little white beard and a pair of gold spectacles, and he looked as happy to see me as I was confused to see him. We stared at each other for a couple of minutes before I finally reached over and opened the door to the cab. He hopped right in, thanking me for my hospitality as he rubbed his hands together. "I was afraid I'd never find anyone to help me out here," he said in a voice that was familiar, though I couldn't place it. "Well, friend, if I wasn't so lost, you'd have been out of luck. I seem to have gotten turned around, and I can't find my way back to Wellerbrook for the life of me." He smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling a little. "Well then, it's you who's in luck, friend. I just happen to know the way back to Wellerbrook if you'd be willing to help me out." I was hesitant, not really trusting some old fella who just appeared out of nowhere like this, but it was Christmas and couldn't just leave him to freeze in the Alaskan wilderness. I assumed that he had a car further down the road that had run out of gas, or maybe he needed to get a lift to the closest town, and these were both things that were within my power to help with. I told him I'd help him, and he smiled as he extended a hand. I shook it, a little electricity passing between us as I did, so I turned the truck back on, and we got moving. "Which way?" I asked, painfully aware that we might both be walking as I looked at the fuel gauge. "Take a left, and I'll guide you from there." I did so, and as the heater warmed the cab, I found myself curious about the old fella. "How did you come to be out here alone on Christmas Eve?" "Oh, I was making some deliveries when my vehicle got away from me." I nodded, glad to see a fellow delivery man out on the road. I can understand that, for I certainly had to learn to keep it on the road and out of the ditches around here. Not always easy with the ice and snow. I remember one time I was delivering a load to Nome, driving the yard's newest truck, when I took a turn too wide and put it nose deep into a snowbank. Wayne was fit to be tied when I called him, but luckily the truck wasn't too badly damaged. The old guy laughed, a real belly shaker, and I found myself laughing too as it infected me. "This is a treacherous country, Jack. You've always got to be on your toes, especially when the weather's bad." I nodded, telling him that was sure so. The name hadn't even registered, but looking back, it should have sent up alarm bells. We rode for a ways, my headlights our only real light source, and I kept a careful eye on the fuel gauge. I knew how much I had, and I knew roughly how far it would take me, which wasn't going to be very far. The moon was a thin sliver in the night sky, casting all that snow in an icy pale sheet, and as we drove, the old man kept a careful eye out for his vehicle. I expected to come upon a truck, or maybe even a long trailer like mine, but the further we went, stranger it seemed not to find one. I began to wonder how far he had walked. "Are we getting close?" I asked him, looking over at him as he smiled placidly. "Oh, I should think so. They couldn't have gotten too far." "They?" I asked, a little confused. "My helpers, the ones I left with the truck." I was a little suspicious, but I tried not to let it show. There was a very good reason why you don't pick up hitchhikers out here, and I was beginning to suspect trouble. He looked like a harmless old man, but that's just what he might want me to think. Especially if he was trying to lure me into a trap. These helpers might be Men who were ready to rob me and leave me in the cold to die. They could be murderers who were going to bury me in a snowdrift where no one might ever find me. Worst of all, they could be, "My land, Jack, have a little more faith in your fellow man. I'd hope the war hadn't changed you that much." I turned to look at him, and when he told me to watch out, I turned the wheel just before I would have ran my truck straight into a snowbank. How did you know what I was thinking? Hell, friend, how do you know my name? The old man opened his mouth a few times as he tried his best to find an answer, but then something caught his eye, and he hollered stop with such ferocity that I had little choice but to oblige. He was out of the cab and into the cold before I had come to a full stop, and I was left watching as he took off for a patch of wood off the road. I called after him, telling him to come back, but that was when I saw what had caught his eye. There was a dent in the snow, something that looked like it had been caused by a very courteous meteor, and the tracks moving away from it made me curious. Despite my better judgment, I was out of the car and, without much thought, pulling my gloves on as I walked past the dent and followed the tracks of the old man. Trap or not, I wanted some answers. I had taken more than my gloves out of the truck, however, and the revolver bumped my hip as I ambled along. The woods were cold and dark, the silver moon cutting a ghostly glow on the snow, and as I moved through the woods, I realized I'd lost the trail. It was the second time that night, I reflected, and I was ready to turn around and find my way back to my truck when I heard a strange noise, the ethereal tinkle of jingle bells. I heard something exhale loudly and turned to find a large deer running towards me. Not just a deer, a reindeer. The reindeer made a sound like an angry hog, and when I threw up a little shield to stop him, he looked confused as he hit the curtain of air. It wouldn't have stopped him in his tracks, not at that point, but the resistance had confused him, and I took advantage of that confusion to draw my gun. The horns on this buck were mighty big, and as I sighted up on him, he seemed to sense the danger he was in and got real still. We stood there, staring at each other for a moment, before a jolly voice called out to me, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't plug my reindeer, Jack." The bells rang merrily as he turned to look at the man, and when I heard the familiar laugh, I looked up to find my passenger, though I gasped at the change he'd undergone. I recognized him now that he had his iconic look, that was. He wore a long, rich red coat, the trim, white fur. His boots were black, the soot still powdering off of them as he walked. He had a long red cap, like a furry nightcap with a ball on the end, and a rotund stomach that, dare I say, shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. The rosy glow of his face had nothing to do with the cold, and his cheeks practically glowed. "Looks like you caught Blitzen before he could get away. He and Vixen got spooked when we ran afoul of some Canadian geese who were on the move. They dumped me out of my sleigh and went to cool off somewhere, taking my conveyance with them. Now that I've got 'em back," and as he said it, I could see 7 more deer behind him, all strapped to a long red sleigh, "I can get back to work." He took Blitzen and reattached him to the sleigh, and as I watched him climb in, he took up the reins and brought him down with a snap. "Follow the road and you'll get back to Willowbrook by 11, he shouted as the deer began to take off. "If I make it," I yelled after him. When the deer lifted him into the sky, I felt the breath whoosh out of me in surprise. "You'll make it," he shouted, laughing again. "Check the back when you get to the yard. I think you'll find something extraordinary." As he disappeared into the sky, I made my way out of the woods and back to the truck. I found my tank full and the gauge didn't go down a bit until I pulled into the depot. I remembered what he'd said when I went to go get in my own truck, and pulled back the fastenings to find the back of the storage area full of wrapped presents. There were gifts for everyone. John's whole family, Wayne and his family, the mechanic we had, Scrap, even a couple for your grandma. I was speechless as I transferred them to my truck, and after dropping Wayne's gifts off in the front porch, I drove home to slip the gifts for John and his family under the tree. I was unloading them, careful to slip the gifts for my new girlfriend back into the cab, and that's when I found one that I must have missed earlier. A gift for me. Merry Christmas, Jack, to help you next time you get lost without a friendly old elf to guide your way. I opened a marvelous road atlas, an atlas that seemed to change with the roads and grow with the land. It served me well, even when I came back to the States, and when I accidentally sold it along with my old pickup truck, I figured it was the old man's way of saying it was time to pass it on. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never forget how I helped Santa and probably saved Christmas. I went and took a sip of my hot chocolate, but found only an empty cup.
Wow, so you really helped Santa cause his time of need?
I sure did, Grandpa said with a little wink. And you stared down a charging reindeer with nothing but a revolver? I asked, maybe sounding a little skeptical for Grandpa's taste. Like I said, I was a much younger man then, he hedged. I wanted to be skeptical, but it was really no more far-fetched than any of Grandpa's other stories. If I believed that he had learned magic from an honest-to-God Native American medicine man, if I believed that he had scared spirits out of people's houses, then I suppose I had to take this at face value too. Grandpa had lived a life of adventure that most would never know, and I suppose I should count myself lucky that he was willing to share it with me.
Another fine tale,
Glimmer said, getting up and raising her empty cup to Grandpa.
Though I hope I get to appear in another one sometime.
I have a few more tales with a certain sparkly moonchild in them, though they aren't stories I often like to remember. She frowned, but looked more sad than cross.
We do have our fair share of sad stories, don't we, Fisher?
He nodded, and Glimmer kissed him on top of his cap as she headed for the back door. I followed behind, receiving a kiss of my own, and the promise of another visit tomorrow before she returned to the woods. Grandpa was snoring lightly when I got back to the living room, and I covered him in a blanket before heading to bed myself. It had been a long and eventful day, and I was ready to snuggle down under my covers and get my own Christmas wish, some uninterrupted sleep. Happy holidays, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for the long-awaited story of how Grandpa saved Christmas. Like most of Grandpa's stories, we just have to take it on faith, but I know so many of you have asked over the years for a little bit of confirmation on this long-awaited tale. As always, I'd like to thank the very talented Dama de Blanco for reprising her role as Glimmer. I think you might be seeing more of her in the Grandpa story soon, not to give anything away. I hope you've all been enjoying these stories this week as we close off the Christmas season, but maybe not the Christmas stories. Next week, I've got another long-awaited story, a story that's got a little bit of everything in it. It's a 5-day event, and I think you'll all really like it. I don't think anybody's been left out, and I think you'll see all your favorites from Kashmir finally come together. This one's been a long time in the making, but I'm glad I really took my time with it, so that I can give you the story you all deserve. Not to spoil it too much, but we may finally see what happens when the Green Man finds the Pale Lady, and maybe what he finds when he comes to Kashmir isn't to his liking. Anyway, Before we go for the night, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors. Thanks to Civ Garstad for being our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, and Saikat for being our Spooky Skeleton contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Sarah ASMR42, and Bella Lee for being our Ghostly Reader contributors. Thanks everyone so much. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to sponsor the show, come on down to Patreon, or look for the subscription tab on YouTube. Either $5 tier gets you your stories a little bit early, and, of course, you'll be supporting a great channel and a great narrator, whoever he may be. And, as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. A very Merry Christmas and a very Happy Holidays to all of you.